Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Good Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Right, okay, so this afternoon we're going to continue with our A to Z of Scottish distilleries, and of course this week we've got to the letter L. So I had a few options, I guess, with the letter L. I could have easily done Laphroaig. I've got absolutely buckets of Laphroaig, sample-wise, mainly independent Laphroaig. And I guess it's probably a toss-up between that and Bamore, possibly Kalila, from what I've tasted the most of from a single distillery. But I thought, well, no, Laphroaig is probably a bit too obvious, although I do love Laphroaig. And I guess having so many samples is very difficult to kind of like pick. And of course, as we know, Laphroaig is a very it's a very, you know, their production is spot on pretty much most of the time. As usual, I'm struggling for the word, but anyway, you know what I mean. It's very consistent. Got it. So having too many samples is probably harder than having not enough, if you see what I mean. Now, anyway, so I thought I'd do Linkwood. Why? Because I like Linkwood. Linkwood's a very not very well. I mean, you see it about, but the point being is, I mean, there's obviously only one distillery bottling, and that's in the Diageo's Flora and Fauna range, and it's not one that sort of, you know, a lot of people instantly go for, although it is a lovely Speyside whisky. And so I dragged all the samples out, and I got a dozen, and I thought, how am I going to sort of structure this? So I thought, we'll do 2 episodes of the show. We'll do young to kind of middle-aged, and then we'll do middle-aged to relatively old. And I thought that would be quite nice. So today we're looking at sort of between 13 and 18 years old, but obviously I'll get on to which particular bottlings we're tasting when we get there. So a bit of history. The distillery was founded in 1821 by a chap called Peter Brown. His son took over some 40 odd years later in 1868. The distillery was then sold to the Linkwood Glenlivet Distillery Company in 1897. And pretty much carried on until it was bought by Diageo, which the book doesn't say, but I don't know exactly when. I haven't looked it up, so it probably sometime in the 80s, I imagine. But anyway, the interesting thing about Linkwood is it's quite a nice sort of traditional brick-built distillery. Although the sort of current distillery dates from 1872, when Peter Brown's son William demolished the distillery that was on site and built a new one. And it sort of started off with 2 stills, like I said, which they then increased in 1971 by adding a further 4 stills. But what they decided to do was build a separate still house building with the new stills and new washbacks and what have you, and effectively closed what was then became known as Linkwood A, and Linkwood B carried on. And it's a bit, you can see it's obviously a slightly more modern building shoved on the kind of the back of the rather nice stone distillery. I believe the old Linkwood A was last used in 1996, although it says here it kind of contradicts itself and said it was closed in 85. So at some stage they transferred all production to Linkwood B. Now, like I said, you know, it's owned by Diageo. It's part of their Flora and Fauna range, which is just a 12-year-old, and that's it. You know, you see a bit of it in Independence, which we're going to obviously look at today. But the bulk of it, again, like a lot of the Scottish distilleries, ends up in the blends, and 2 in particular, White Horse and Johnny Walker. It's a fairly large component part there of those 2 blends. So that's a quick waffle about the actual distillery. Let's introduce this afternoon's lineup. Okay, so like I said, we're going to kick off with a 13-year-old. This has been bottled by A.D Rattray. It was distilled in 2001 and bottled in 2014. Bottled at 56.9 from Bourbon Cask 2992. Then we shall move on to the first of 2 Old Malt Cask Hunter Laing bottlings. This was distilled in 1998, October, and bottled in August of 2014, thus making it 15 years old. And it's interesting just to few more years, and the colour is quite significantly darker, probably a more active cask as well. The second OMC bottling we'll be looking at is a 16-year-old distilled in 1996 November and bottled in October 2013. The fourth bottling we'll be looking at is a Douglas Laing Old Particular bottling, so this is a relatively recent bottling. In actual fact, it was bottled in July of last year. Distilled in June of 1997, it's 18 years old and bottled at 48.4%. Second to last bottling is another Hunter Laing Old Malt Cask bottling, again dating from 1997. June in actual fact, so probably bought at exactly the same time as the previous one, so that'll be interesting to see if there's a great deal of difference between the two. And it was bottled in July of 2015. In actual fact, sorry, the Old Particular was bottled in September of 2014. This was the newer one, July of last year. And finally, we'll be looking at the one and only sherried Linkwood. Now, I've come across a few sherried Linkwoods, and some of them from the 80s were a little bit suspect, a bit like some of the Malt lacks, you know, a little bit sulphury. So let's hope this isn't too bad, because it is from the late 80s, from 89. In actual fact, it was bottled in 2007 at its natural cask strength of 58.7% from Sherry Cask 3196. So there you have it. Quite an interesting spread of ages, from young to sort of middle age, with a sherry one chucked in. So let's crack on then, shall we? Now, the thing I like about Linkwood is it can be sort of quite different. I mean, the distillery bottling is quite light, classically spey, you know, some nice oak, and it can be quite nice and crisp and fresh. But on the other hand, I have tasted Linkwoods that are nice, big and fat and malty. So let's see what we get then. A little bit on the neutral side. I mean, it's possibly that this particular sample hasn't stood up to the test of time, but it's got some nice crisp, really mineral barley notes, some herbs, almost kind of grainy, which is probably, like I said, the sample not particularly showing amazingly well. A lovely freshness. Not a great deal of oak, as you can see from the colour of it. It's got virtually no vanilla character, no oak whatsoever. So you're getting all the fresh, slightly citrus, slightly dusty, gristy barley coming through. A little bit of barley sweetness. It's pleasant. I mean, this is kind of pretty much classic Linkwood, really, classic spey. Palate. A little fuller on the palate, a little bit more thicker barley, a bit of honey, very, very, very herbal. I mean, sort of ferns, not quite medicinal herbs, but sort of kind of getting in that kind of direction. Slightly rye-like herbs with that slight bitterness and that slight astringency. A little bit more oak. Probably need a little bit of water to soften, but I don't have enough to do that with. But again, lovely whisky, fresh, crisp, aperitif style, not a great deal of oak, fairly unpretentious, just a nice style for it. Right, so moving on 3 years, let's have a look at the 15-year-old. Let's see what this gives us. As I expected, a lot more oak, sort of buttery, vanilla-y, creamy, slight bit of toffee. Very, very dominant, not getting a huge amount of distillery character. There's a little bit of barley, a little bit of barley sweetness, but the nose is basically saying oak, 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 you know, which is not bad. It's pleasant. Just a little bit sort of, you know, like I said, skewed in the oak department, you know. Yeah. I mean, it's lovely. It's got some lovely toasty notes. It's got, you know, lovely clean, and if you like a lot of oak in your whiskey, then you know this would have been a bottle that you would have quite enjoyed back in 2014. Palate? A little bit nice. I think the palate is slightly better balanced. There's still quite a bit of oak with that creaminess up front, a little bit of toffee, but real minerality kind of coming through, and some citrus notes as well that actually freshen. I can still taste obviously the oak on the aftertaste. The sort of the creamy butteriness kind of continues, but it just doesn't get too blousy and too out of shape. Not amazingly complex, it has to be said, but what it does, it delivers particularly nicely. Pleasant balance. The aftertaste is it starts off oak, then you get a bit of sort of barley, bit of citrus, and that those kind of two flavours just kind of sort of rumble on towards the end. And like I said, really nicely balanced, but yeah, possibly a little bit heavy on the oak. Okay, so moving on 1 year, different bottling. As you can see from the colour, again, I don't think a huge amount of oak, certainly not as much as oak as the last one, so let's see what the nose gives us. This is more like the 13-year-old. Quite herbal, some nice barley, fresh, very citric. Citrus notes are kind of like sort of balancing up that sort of really herbal, dusty barley character. A little bit of sweetness, a little bit of estery fruit coming through, a little bit of apricot. Quite aromatic, getting slightly perfumed now, a little bit of white fruits, a little bit of pear. That is absolutely gorgeous. That is lovely, lovely, aromatic and fresh and crisp. You know, that's kind of sort of, you know, middle-aged or sort of slightly starting to get to middle-aged, kind of slightly more weightier spey character. Absolutely delightful. Palate. Palate is slightly deeper, slightly bigger, slightly more malt. I'm getting a lot of malt. A little bit more oak character, so a little bit more toffee. Maybe not quite as fresh, although there is some citrus notes kind of coming through. Again, weighty, full, very broad and juicy. Lovely finish, sort of a little bit of minerality kind of coming through on the finish. Tastes relatively young. I mean, you know, for a 15-year-old, 16-year-old, sorry, not showing a huge amount of maturity. It's still wonderfully fresh, which is probably a characteristic of Linkwood. This is why you see some very, very old Linkwoods. I've certainly got some old ones coming up in the next episode of the show, shall we say, and that's probably what allows it to age, is the fact that it just does not seem to sort of get old particularly quickly. Which is not a bad thing, I suppose, is it really? I'm not sure you're able to feel it all. So much to say. Okay, moving on 1 year, and it'll be interesting to see how these two compare, as they were probably bought at exactly the same time. Both, like I said, both distilled in June of 1997. So it'll be interesting to see how those two compare as they do with all the others. So anyway, let's see what those gives. Similar to the 16-year-old, maybe not quite so herbal, still quite broad and juicy, with again some lovely dusty barley. Relatively herbal, full, not quite so many, not so much esters kind of coming through. It's more barley focused. Lovely, lovely herbal character. Yeah, very, very nice, really pleasant. Palate. Kind of kicks off more with the citrus fruit, a little bit of grapefruit, a bit of lemon possibly. Then the barley comes in and a little bit of oak follows that. That's a lovely progression. That's a really nice Speyside whisky. Really moist, juicy finish. I mean, sort of palate is really mouth-watering, although not mouth-watering in an intense alcoholic stroke citrus kind of way. It's just mouth-watering from a juicy, fruity kind of character. Again, quite barleyed, easy going, you know, just all round really very, very enjoyable. Okay, so moving on yet another year to the 18-year-old. Let's see what this is like then, shall we? A little bit more fresher, not quite so full. Again, herbal, getting a little more biscuity notes, a bit more sort of malt, shredded wheat, that kind of thing. Again, subtle oak, just sort of sitting nicely in the background. Smells a little bit older, although it's only just 1 year older. And this goes to show you, know, it's the variations between casks. I mean, there's an obvious similarity between the two, but yet, like I said, this is slightly more maltier nose. Still very good, really nice. Palate. Crisp, soft, although a little bit watery possibly. Some nice violets, which is unusual. Don't normally kind of get that kind of character coming through in Linkwood. Not as herbal as the palate, a little bit of oak. I don't think that one quite developed as well as the previous bottling, but still, you know, pleasant. Maybe the sample has kind of decayed a little bit over the course of time, although in actual fact, you know, that only came from last year. Yeah, nice, not kind of, I think the nose was probably more interesting than the palate on that particular cask, but still, yeah, pleasant. And finally, we're on to the Sherry Monster. Well, maybe it's a Sherry Monster, who knows? Let's see what the nose gives us. Oh yes, that's a big Sherry Monster. Lots and lots of dried fruits, prune, dried plum, big treacle, molasses, dark toffee. Funnily enough, no real distillery character. I mean, that's the thing. It's not exactly a strong, characterful malt. So stuff that into sherry, and you ain't gonna get an awful lot other than sherry. I mean, it's very good, clean sherry. I hasten to add, no sulphur blemishes whatsoever. Very kind of dark, grapey, some moist, dried fruits. Yeah, I mean, you can't fault it as a sherry cask, but it's kind of, like I said, not exactly going to get an awful lot of distillery character. Palate? Whoa, that's drying, that's got some tannin. Coupled with the alcohol, that makes it really quite dry. Yeah, pretty much as you would expect. The moist, dried fruits, kind of nice Oloroso kind of character. Very clean, quite nutty, a little bit of salinity, plenty of dried fruit, a little bit of chocolatey tannins, some drier kind of woody tannins. As a sherry matured whisky, very, very enjoyable. You know, I'm not going to say it isn't. No real distillery character, although I kind of got the impression of a little bit of barley, certainly on the entry, but you know, pretty much all about the all about the cask. I'm going to stick a little drop of water and just see what happens. See if that makes any real change to it. Lighter, a little bit more orange, a little bit more satsuma possibly. Slightly higher tone, slightly more nutty. Less of the treacle, which is kind of what I would have expected to happen, putting a little drop of water to it. Getting a little bit of barley kind of coming through, so almost feeling kind of refilled sherry when touch of spice, a little bit of cinnamon possibly, but it's still pretty much all about the cask. But like I said, good clean cask, so yeah. A little bit more coffee, pruny, armagnac-y, rich, full, still very soft, absolutely gorgeous in actual fact as far as a sherry cask whiskey goes. So you know, if you had bought a bottle of that, if I stocked it, which I can't remember whether I did or not, I mean, because we're going back, you know, to 2007, I probably stocked it. Yeah, nice whiskey, you know, good sherry cask. What more can you say? Okay, so let's sum today's little tasting up. So what have we learnt about Linkwood then? It's kind of, when it's young, it's a classic Speyside whiskey. It's got that sort of lovely sort of citrus character, the slight grassiness, stroke herbalness, minerality, freshness, you know, so it's a lovely whiskey. The 13-year-old, well, you know, you can't argue with that. It was very much not a great deal of oak kind of character, so you got all of the kind of spirit character, the sort of the freshness, the citricness, you know, just really very, very nice. The 15-year-old, again, pleasant, possibly a little bit too much oak maybe, you know, so that maybe that particular cask was pretty much a first fill American oak cask, one would imagine, so pretty active. Still, it's a style. If you like that kind of style, then still pleasant. 16-year-old, yeah, kind of classic sort of middle-aged kind of Linkwood, really, sort of slightly more malty, richer, bigger, which kind of followed through to the sort of the following two, the 16 and the 17. Obviously, out of the two, I think that particular cask, the one that was bottled by Douglas Laing after the split, possibly matured a little bit better than the Hunter Laing one. But you know, you're kind of splitting hairs on that one, really. The palate was a little bit disappointing on that one, but you know, que sera, sera, as they say. And the 18-year-old from A.D Rattray, well, you know, I think as a sherry cask whiskey goes, pleasant, blemish-free, relative amount of complexity from the cask, not a great deal from the distillery character, but you know, that's kind of the thing that happens with sort of the lighter, or relatively lighter kind of characters, malt. So there you have it. That's kind of young to middle-aged Linkwood in the bag. I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of the show, and I've got no whiskey left, so good dramming and good afternoon.